On the line with us is Dr. Trita Parsi, the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. QuincyInst.org is the website, or responsiblestatecraft.org. His Twitter handle is T-Parsi, P-A-R-S-I. Dr. Parsi, welcome back to the program. President Biden, thank you. President Biden just came back from Saudi Arabia. And, you know, this whole issue with regard to the Iran nuclear deal seems to be, you know, totally screwed up. Obviously, you know, Donald Trump blew this thing up. You write over at Common Dreams, you wrote a piece that says if oil prices are really the driving force behind Biden's, you know, negotiations with the Saudis, then he should have just gone back into the Iran nuclear deal through an executive order. Can you explain to me what how that could be done?
Yeah, so one of the big mistakes that the Biden administration did is that they just didn't go back into the Iran nuclear deal right away. They felt that they had to negotiate their way back and try to get a longer and stronger deal. What they could have done is just through an executive order, go back into the deal. There would be some issues that would have to be resolved, but those would be resolved from within the deal, where the U.S. would have regained the moral authority of having become a partner of the JCPOA again. And it would also regain the leverage of being able to trigger snapback sanctions on Iran if the Iranians were violating something. Instead, they chose to go through the negotiating, you know, try to renegotiate the deal, essentially. And it's been a year and a half, and it's been a failure. But if they had gone back in, I mean, right now, for instance, the Iranians have roughly 85 million barrels of oil that they have pumped out of the ground. 25 million are on tankers on the high seas, another 60 inside of Iran. They can't sell them because of U.S. sanctions. If the U.S. were to go back into the deal, sanctions would be lifted. We would suddenly have a significant influx of oil onto the market at a time when Americans are hurting tremendously because of high oil prices, inflation, and other countries in Europe are hurting even more. So if oil was the driving force behind this, then he could have actually gotten more by just going back into the Iran deal rather than going and begging the Saudis, frankly, in my view, humiliating himself and getting nothing for it.
The Saudis and the Israelis are the major barrier here, are they not? Or is it that the Iranians are putting up new demands as well? I know that they've enriched a lot more uranium than they had before.
Yeah, certainly. The Iranians have done a lot of highly problematic things. They have expanded their program. They're refusing to talk directly with the United States, which has made these negotiations extremely challenging and difficult and time-consuming. But I think ultimately at this point, a big problem is that the Biden administration essentially says that there's nothing they can do to ensure that this deal can survive beyond their own term, but frankly also potentially not even during their term. What the Iranians are worried about is that if the Republicans take the House and the Senate in November, then the Republicans are in a position to potentially take away the president's waiver rights. The way it works is this. The U.S. actually doesn't lift sanctions on Iran. It waives those sanctions. And the president can make a determination whether he thinks it's valid to waive those sanctions or not. So these are congressional sanctions, but the president has the right to waive them. Those waivers are written into the sanctions bill, so they're controlled by Congress. Congress can undo them. And then suddenly the president cannot waive sanctions, and as a result, the JCPOA would collapse once more because the U.S. would not be able to fulfill its obligations. So we're talking about a situation in which, let's imagine that the deal is struck next week, in end of July, and by November, 3 months later, it's dead again because of the Republicans taking over. Now, of course, the Republicans don't take the Congress until January. It may be difficult for them to do this, but the mere fact that they would try is sufficient to create a massive chilling effect amongst the business community, and as a result, make sure that they don't go back into the Iranian market in the first place.
Right. So if we do it legislatively, they can reverse it if they seize control of the House and Senate. If we do it by executive order, they could reverse it if they get control of the White House in 2 years. So, which raises the question in my mind: what's in it for the Republicans in destabilizing the Middle East and further empowering Iran? I don't get it.
Well, it's a question you would have to ask them. But I can tell you that it seems like they're not really thinking about U.S. national interests or stability. They may be motivated by arms sales. I mean, we saw that Trump really liked the idea of selling far more weapons to the Saudis than the U.S. had done before, and the U.S. was already the biggest arms provider to the Saudis. I think there's plenty of them that believe that some form of confrontation with Iran is not only inevitable, it's desirable. And there's also some who believe that it is a way of helping Israel. I mean, there's all kinds of different factors. None of them, in my view, seem to actually be centered on what's good for the United States.
Is a piece of it just that the original deal was negotiated by a Democratic president and a black president at that? I mean, let's not discount the racism that has seized the Republican Party. And they just don't want Obama to have any kind of legacy of consequence?
I think that is a factor, but I think it's a factor more in Trump's mind necessarily than in the general GOP.
Right.
I think he was obsessed with undoing anything that had Obama's name on it. But, you know, Republicans were against the JCPOA long before Trump. In fact, Trump wasn't even that hardcore against the JCPOA during the campaign. Others were much more hawkish on that issue. Right. And many of them clearly were, you know, listening and perhaps influenced by the thinking of those such as Sheldon Adelson and his family and others who looked at this issue very much from the same perspective as the Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu.
Right. I get where Israel is all bent out of shape about Hezbollah and its funding by the Iranians, and there's a long historic background there. I don't understand why Saudi Arabia is opposed to the Iran deal.
Well, from the Saudi perspective, the original opposition to the deal was not anything to do with whether the deal was strong enough or weak enough, whether it had enough restrictions on their program, all of these different things that the Israelis were complaining about. For them, it was mostly, why are you making a deal with Iran? Are you looking to replace Saudi Arabia as a strategic partner and pivot to Persia, so to say? They were afraid that this was the ticket for the United States to slowly but surely start disengaging militarily from the region and leave. And what they have benefited from, as have the Emiratis, as have the Israelis as well, is unnatural, manufactured, artificial balance of power in the region, which is simply there because the U.S. has put its very heavy finger on the scale. It's a very beneficial balance for these states, but not a balance that any of them, with the potential exception of Israel, could actually achieve on its own. If the United States leaves, the region is going to recalibrate its balance, and it is not going to be as favorable towards Saudi Arabia and the UAE because these are not, at the end of the day, particularly powerful states.
Right.
So for them, it's very selfish, obviously. But I have to say one thing: I don't think we can blame the Saudis for pursuing their interests here. Right. We should blame ourselves for not pursuing ours.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. And I'm laying a lot of this at the feet of the Republicans. The last question, what is the future of Iran right now? There's this worldwide battle, it seems, between autocracy and democracy. Is there a consequential democracy movement in Iran? Is it still firmly under the control of the mullahs, of the theocrats? Are there any bright? Do you see any favorable or positive things for the possibility of something like democracy in Iran?
I saw plenty of hope and positive signs years ago, and a lot of them, if not most of them, were crushed by Trump leaving the JCPOA, reimposing sanctions, crushing the Iranian economy, but also by Biden not going back into the deal. Because from the perspective of some of the reformists in Iran who were pushing for the deal and who were arguing that a large part of Iran's problems are going to be resolved if Iran can just work out its problems with the United States. That entire theory has fallen apart, not because Trump left. That was a big blow to it. But once Biden didn't go back in, one could no longer say that Trump was the aberration. Instead, it was Obama that was the aberration. And that has been devastating for those in Iran who have been arguing in favor of some form of a reconciliation with the United States and even in some form of orientation towards the West. And that has been tremendously negative for democracy in Iran.
That's very unfortunate. Dr. Trita Parsi, thank you so much for dropping by.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Always great talking with you. I always learn something.
You too.
Thank you.